So we got started in this session a little bit late, but we should still have around 15 minutes for questions, I think. So I'll start off with one question, hopefully get some good conversation going, and then hopefully have time for a couple audience questions. So get those questions prepared. And so I guess what I'll start with is asking what some of the, I guess, both biggest successes and I don't want to say failures, but I'll say lessons learned from either building or running the hubs and networks that you do run are. Thinking of what can be transferred to other scientific research hubs and networks, as well as non-scientific ones. So I guess we'll start with Margareta and go down.
This one works as well, fantastic. So I think the biggest success with Interact is that it's a bottom-up initiative. So all the research stations, the 83 research stations, have joined the network without getting a single dollar or krona or whatever we are talking in currency. And because of that, you have everyone is just contributing a lot, and we can also always ensure that we can collaborate despite the political climate in the world. So I think that is definitely our biggest success.
So I guess as a virtual hub, I'll try and tailor my answers towards the online world. I think our biggest success is our continued growth of our space. It seems we've had pretty much linear, steady growth since we started 4 years ago now. And really steady participation on the site, lots of posts. And I think that's because people are getting value out of knowing what's going on in the hub and having that easily delivered to their inboxes where they can make it easy to just check in as part of their normal work routine. Yeah.
So, biggest success and biggest failures. I think it's the same thing. I mentioned earlier that I thought the universities should work more closely together within the University of the Arctic, and we've had a success where we had a common course between Tromsø, Akureyri, Newfoundland, St. John's, and Alaska, the University of Alaska. And we're able to run a course on international fisheries. But that really only survived as long as the academics were willing to put in the effort and extra hours and time zones and so on. Were definitely an issue in that. So at the same time as it was a success, I think it was an institutional failure that we were not able to make this as a part of the curriculum, rather than just an elective thing that happens within every other or every third year, depending on how busy the academics are. So for some reason, and I think that might relate to what Embla was saying earlier, despite having all of this knowledge within the University of the Arctic, all of this research collaboration that's really happening within specific networks, it has not become an institutionalized process to work together and share knowledge from research. I think that's our biggest failure. At the same time, it's our biggest success that we've been able to build such a big network.
Well, I think I may have already indicated in my talk earlier what our major challenges have been. I think what I have learned through the 5 years is also that it is important to identify the passionate individuals within institutions, because I think if you're developing a network, it's quite easy to agree to cooperate and then swap logos and sign something, but then you need to figure out who is there that is passionate enough to, in some cases, for instance in Iceland, give their time in order to make the connections actually work. I also think that what we need to do is be a little bit more selective in which direction we want to grow. Do we want to expand, or do we want to grow deeper in a way? So in that respect, I think both for hubs and for networks, I think it's a question of defining the success that we want to see. We went from 10 originally to 30. And we could conceivably continue to grow. We could grow outside of the country. I've often thought that it would be interesting if we can try to reach out to Faroe Islands and Greenland and other networks in other countries and other centers in other countries. But you at the same time have to figure out how do we move forward and try to be productive. I think we can talk about different, if you want to talk about really successful projects, I want to identify, for instance, Interact as a very successful project. You were talking earlier about the guidelines that you have for research stations. And I'm on the board of a very, very, very small research station in the northeast of Iceland, which is called Reef Research Station, if somebody wants to go there. And there's one person working there. And in addition to a project that the station is working on with CAF, it wouldn't have been possible for them to build up what they have already in the short time that we've had without the information and the support of the Interact network. So I would say that that is definitely a successful network. Also, at the risk of sounding like a total kiss-ass, I think that Arctic Circle could be considered a very successful hybrid hub and network. They're very effectively intertwining these two models, I think, and making sure that they do indeed grow by moving the hub between places. So their physical space is different, and it also, I think, attracts different elements and different ideas.
Great, thank you. Are there any burning questions in the audience? Raise your hand and I think we'll be able to get you a microphone. We've got one right there. Microphone should be moving to you in just a second. Hopefully. There we go. Definitely works.
I'm going to sit down so I can see my iPad with my notes, but I did have two questions. Embla, you sort of answered the first one because my question would have been, do you not really need someone driving work that's done in networks, hubs, clusters? Because otherwise, as you said, potential for static. Second question, though, is do any of your networks, could be totally naive, I don't know, but so much knowledge exchange, expertise, but do any of you have outward facing, how do we ensure that the public or the communities that we serve are aware of what we do, plain language reports, communication plans? I'm involved in the Arctic Council, and it's one of the challenges we have. How do we communicate so much work to the public? So I just wonder if you guys have any lessons. Thanks.
Go for it, Eilvar, and then anyone else speak up
Thank you.
after.
On the first question, since Embla answered in the sense that you need somebody to drive it, that's absolutely correct. But you can only do that for so long. So once you have gotten the driver to drive and got the vehicle moving, you have to find out a way to make it a sustainable path. And that's where what I was mentioning earlier, finding models that allow for sustainable collaboration that becomes meaningful over time hasn't been discovered yet. And that would be very interesting if people were able to kind of figure out what it is really that drives these collaborations. Point number two, I said too much, so it slipped my mind. Point number two was again the... How do we make communities aware of what we do? How to, as a university, this is a constant challenge. And we are now aiming for our next strategic vision period to simply make it a part of the academic to communicate in as we would do in our graduate school in the old days. Write a letter to your grandma about what you do and do not use any scientific words. So we will start to appreciate that type of work from our academics. And I think that's really what it boils down to. You have to give people time to communicate.
In terms of the first question, I wanted to build on what you said about finding passionate people within the various nodes within a network and a hub, and also having a central person driving. Obviously, that's critical. But I think it's more than just passion from those parts of a network that you need. You really need an incentive for each of those individuals to participate in the network. So in our network, the agencies that might not have as big of a budget for research, they have an incentive to participate in our network because they can leverage some of the resources of the bigger budget, larger agencies. The larger agencies don't have that much of an incentive, and sometimes it just falls back on that passionate person to keep the connection going and to keep it sustainable. So I really think that's a key lesson that we learned, is you have to make it worth somebody's while to participate. That's the trick. As for science communication, I'm the communications officer at my hub. I'm both the hub manager, the community manager, and the communications officer. And I'm really passionate about science communication, and I don't think you can just tell a scientist, write a letter to your grandma and expect them to do it well, simply because scientists and people in the science community don't receive that kind of training to become scientists. I really think they should receive communications training, and actually through IARPIC, we have a new initiative to give early career scientists who are hungry for that kind of training a course, an online course, and then sometimes in-person courses on how to be a better communicator, particularly focused on public speaking. And we actually have a webinar coming up later this month, it's only 2 weeks away, of a few early career scientists who went through this course, and they're going to speak about what they're working on designed for a public audience. So I think it really takes a extra effort to do that well.
In terms of outreach, I think, first of all, personally, I'm very lucky. I have a vocabulary which only contains simple words, so that makes it very much simpler to communicate to everyone. But I think in terms of Interact and how we try to communicate is that we try to be a little bit innovative. I understand that everyone tries to be that, and I'm sure we are not more innovative than other people. But for example, at the Arctic Circle meeting last year in Reykjavik, rather than arranging a special session with presenting talks, we had a base camp where we had people came and they played card games. The card games was with all the Interact stations. You could learn where they are located, how much precipitation, blah, 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 blah. Another way of communicating. I'm not going to talk about what we actually drank during that session, but the card game was, I think, a success. Don't you agree, Alan?
It was a very successful session.
Yeah.
Eilver and then Embla.
Just a very short addition to that. We do indeed need more innovative ways of communicating. And when I mentioned earlier that the scientists should be writing letters back to grandma, I also mentioned that they would need more time. They need to learn how to write that letter. That's definitely true. But in terms of dissemination and communication, we saw, how many research stations did you have? 83 research stations. Have you ever calculated how long it would take you to travel and visit all of them?
Too long?
Too long, exactly. I recently saw a virtual world simulation where you are walking up Mount Everest. And it is really as if you are walking up Mount Everest. Technology today, in terms of virtual worlds, allows us to go and visit places that is very unlikely that we can physically visit. You do not really have to write a long report. You don't really have to be very specific about describing what's going on. You can simply allow people to put on goggles and they are there. That would be one way of giving people access to all of these research stations that are located around the Arctic. It's very difficult to travel to. So yes, we need to be innovative.
Can I just say that we do have virtual tours of our research stations that we are doing and that they are on our website?
But not in the 3D?
not in the 3D, in the, using a company, yeah.
It's interesting that you asked that question, because we were just having that discussion yesterday. Eiríkur and Katrina sitting there in the audience. How do we communicate, for instance, in our community in Akureyri, what we're doing on the Arctic, and how do we communicate to people how it is relevant to them? And we're still trying to figure it out, and maybe we'll get some ideas from this panel. But what we're really talking about is sort of marketing psychology in a way. How do you make people interested in stuff that they're not that interested in, you know, that are relevant to them, but they are not necessarily perceived as relevant? And I think that just as scientists should be trained in communicating efficiently the information that they gather and their research, the rest of us need to figure out a way to effectively communicate to other people what is going on. And I think that requires understanding how information is relevant to the public, and understanding that we can't leave it up to the media to explain to the public what is relevant. Because if we do that, then there's always going to be a select few topics, for instance, in the Arctic, that are perceived as relevant, and others that are perhaps more relevant to the people that live there are not perceived as terribly important.
Even within the science community, we often talk about, communicating outside of the scientific community, but it's an incredibly broad and diverse group to begin with, and working on communication within our networks and hubs probably will facilitate outward communication even more, and it seems like you have a response to that.
Well, it's just, I'm really passionate about the whole interdisciplinary thing, between social and natural science as well, because I think very often people tend to think of interdisciplinary cooperation between natural scientists as a species, and then social scientists as a different kind of species. And now they're not different kinds of species, but they do speak a very different kind of language. And I think that's part of what we need to figure out. How do we understand meaning and terms and language, and how do we have the patience to learn? I mean, for me, for instance, as a social scientist, to learn about natural science concerns, and vice versa.
To follow up on the interdisciplinary communication comment, one of the first exercises I have my students do in the course, they're all from different disciplines, is just say one sentence about the research they do and have everybody else write down the words that they didn't understand, and there's always far too many words. So I think we really overlook interdisciplinary communication as a skill that needs to be learned. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and point out, I wanted to talk about one best practice we found as a virtual hub that's related to this. So we are virtual and most of our meetings are online. Once a year, we do gather all of our team leaders in one place, and so that's scientists from various disciplines, both social and natural sciences, to discuss how they're going to do what they're going to do for the year. And that in-person meeting is really important for driving the rest of the virtual meetings for the whole year. This year I saw some social scientists and some sea ice scientists sit down together at a table and say, okay, so we want to improve our sea ice forecasts. What do you social scientists need from sea ice forecasts? And they said, well, the subsistence hunters really want to know when the land fast ice will be there or not on a 7-week time scale. And the sea ice scientist said, oh yeah, that's actually easier for us to do. So it was really amazing to watch this interdisciplinary collaboration happen when there was enough time and people in the room thoughtfully communicating with each other.
Great, and unfortunately, I think we've reached the end of our time, so I just want to say thank you to our panelists. Thanks for ending on those very helpful notes, and if there were any words that you didn't understand as we were talking, thanks for the tip, Jessica, you can come find us afterwards, so thank you so much.